Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Is junk news worse than junk food? Jodie Jackson will help us decide. Jodie, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jodie, you've written a book called You Are What You Read. Now, today so much we see papers, newspaper, books, emails that we're getting. Our brains are being hit with many negative messages. How does that affect our well-being?
Well, when you're looking at the news, it's really important to understand as consumers that the news industry in the UK, certainly, and in the US, has a mantra: if it bleeds, it leads. So we're given the most negative version of the world presented back to us. And the problem with this is it means the news isn't giving us a reflection of everything that goes on. It's giving us a reflection of everything that goes wrong. And over prolonged periods of time, so when we're bombarded with these messages over a long period without actually being shown what's done about it, then it can make us feel anxious and pessimistic and depressed. And these feelings linger even when we switch off from the news because we become so well rehearsed at feeling them. But we also develop a feeling of helplessness. Because we see these problems as being too big to solve, we actually stop trying to. And that's a really important thing to touch on, how we engage and behave with the information, because we can also stop trying to help because we experience increased feelings of contempt and hostility towards other people. And fear is another common response that can make us withdrawn and unhelpful because it's an emotion that's generated to protect ourselves. So it makes us very self-focused. We become less concerned about other people and the problems that they can be facing. But we can also just stop caring because we become so desensitized. We become so used to hearing about these stories of tragedy, crisis, and violence, and they lose their shock value. And ultimately, we can switch off from the news altogether to try and avoid these feelings. So it has some, in the kind of excessive quantities that we consume it in at the moment, it does have some damaging consequences.
It sounds like after hearing that, I would never want to hear the news again, nor listen to it, nor read it. Now, we're in modern life, obviously, and you say that calls for new operating instructions. But I guess, unfortunately, nobody really tells us that. It's not taught in school. And until I saw that topic in your book, I really never thought of it that way, to be honest. Can you give us some idea what you mean by that?
I think there's a base level of media literacy that's perhaps really useful for us to know as consumers, knowing that there is a production process to the news, knowing that it's driven by commercial incentives as well as incentives for kind of social impact and knowledge. Understanding that is really important, and also understanding the environment of the news, because like I said, with these consequences that can happen, it's not actually that hearing about problems or negativity is bad for us. It's not. It's actually really good. It's very valuable. It's important to feel uncomfortable. By challenging injustices and highlighting problems, it's helped us progress as a society and helped us create legislation that's improved our safety and our functioning. But where we sort of have it to where it's helpful, it's moved past that point, and where we have it in this excessive consumption that we have in the moment with the 24-hour news cycles, the social media channels, with content being churned out literally by the second. We're now in an environment where we're oversupplied and underinformed, and it's this excess that really forces us to redefine the way in which we consume the news, and really calls on consumers to be more deliberate in their consumption. Because where it was much more infrequent and about things that were truly newsworthy, we now have this hugely kind of sped up, watered down style of the news that just keeps us hooked for keeping us hooked. And it's checking in to see how valuable this information is and trimming the fat for ourselves.
Now, when the media is putting on a show, etc., meaning the typical evening news or Sunday news or whatever, is it creating news or reflecting the news?
I think it's probably both. I think that by, reporting on a reality, then it's not necessarily creating that. It is reflecting it. It's reflecting a reality of the world. But the trouble is, because it only reflects certain parts of our reality, we get a very distorted picture of it as consumers. We have this huge overrepresentation of problems combined with this huge underrepresentation of solutions, and it leaves us with a fundamental misunderstanding of the world. So we're given an impression that the world's broken beyond repair and as if it's in a rapid state of decline. Whereas when you look at kind of key measurements about the world and its condition today, you'll actually see that it's perhaps moving in a different direction than the headlines would have us believe. And so it does, although it's reflecting a reality, the kind of selective attention of the news, especially geared towards the negative aspects of it, definitely creates a new reality because we define ourselves and our behaviors within that narrative. And it can move us in a direction that perhaps we might not otherwise if we had a more complete and accurate picture of the world that included solutions as well as problems.
Maybe that's the new show, Solutions. And it comes on right after the news and tells us what we could do, and maybe generates a lot of discussion, actually, on some of the problems. And maybe we get people into it, almost like sports talk radio, where everybody knows what should have been done after the game is over. Jodie, we just want our audience to know that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Today we're talking to Jodie Jackson. She is the author of You Are What You Read. And Jodie, could you tell us where we can get the book and if there's a website where we can get some more information about this?
Yeah, of course. It's available in the US. It launched last month in the US, and it's available on Amazon.com, at Barnes & Noble, and IndieBound, which has a list of all of the independent book stockists that have copies of the book. And my website is youarewhatyouread.com. And on there, you have a lot of information about the movement for solutions journalism, as well as a starter kit for if you are interested in educating on yourself on solutions, where's some of the best places to go to get good quality sources.
I like that, and I like that we're moving in that direction of solutions, perhaps, rather than just telling people what's wrong and what we have to do, etc. Do we tend to watch stations that support our political, religious, athletic views, or do most people want the opposite so they can argue with them? Which direction do most people go?
I don't even think that's our choice anymore. The way that in the US, certainly, I think the latest statistic was 67% of people get their news from social media. And when you've got that level of consumption on those platforms, you lose that choice really to challenge yourself to see different viewpoints, because you kind of become encased in your own echo chamber. The way that the algorithms work on those social platforms is that it gives you content that you are going to like, or that it thinks you're going to like based on your previous interaction with content. And so even though it's created by or created for you, it's not actually created by you so deliberately. And so you find yourself in this space where the world is reflecting back what you already think, which further reinforces what you already think. So, one of my recommendations is to actually step offline, to either look at print journalism, even a weekly news show that you could watch, to expose yourself to a different conversation that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily get.
Now, what I see, if I guess, and I'm sure there's some experiments to this effect, and maybe you even have them in different parts of the book. When I see a certain event, I may come out with one perception, and you might come out with another. And maybe this is even affected by certain biases I have. If I root for a certain political party or a team, I might think anything they do is more on the correct or perfect side, and vice versa. Is this true, and how does this affect everything that we're hearing and seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something in psychology known as the availability theory. So how available something is, and we equate that availability with truth. So the more we see something, the more common we believe it to be, and the more accurate we believe it to be. So when we are tuning into things that reinforce our own preference, we're actually convincing ourselves further that we are right, that this is true, and that a different opinion is perhaps wrong or incorrect because we are less exposed to it. So I think that we do definitely sympathize more with our existing viewpoint than we do with other people's. And I think that the way in which the media has also encouraged that divide as a way to stimulate debate, but hasn't perhaps done it in the best way, because it usually takes, the thing about the news is it usually takes the extreme and the extraordinary rather than the normal and the ordinary. So you find yourself, when you're having a debate about differences, you find yourself at two completely polarized points. And as consumers, it kind of pushes you to your own extremes, because if you are agreeing with one, it's very difficult to agree with the other because they're so far apart from each other. And so it kind of, that distance that's created on a national debate is then kind of filtered down to a more individual level that creates divides within society more socially when we're talking about issues, because the way in which the debate is framed is so separated in the first place. So I think anything you can do to try and find a way to disagree productively, to expose yourself to other ways of thinking, to find commonality between opposing thoughts is a really useful way to be able to constructively engage with different opinions.
Now, isn't it, even though it's kind of bad news, isn't it good that we're always made aware of things like school shootings, a criminal who might be on the loose, a popular scam that's going around that might, influence people or hurt them or, relieve them of their money. Let's put it that way. Isn't this a good thing, even though, like I say, it might be a negative type of story, but doesn't it serve a good purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. Problems-focused news is incredibly valuable. By asking the challenging questions, highlighting failures, exposing corruptions, and making us aware of problems, as well as holding power to account, the news has been incrementally important in helping us fight and correct injustice. It's kept people safe. And like I said, it's helped drive legislation that's improved society. And this is because unless we're made aware of a problem, we can't understand it, confront and correct it. So it is a good thing. But just because something's good, it doesn't mean its benefits are endless. and it's noticing or understanding that point of where something that is genuinely helpful becomes harmful, and actually looking at that environment to see where it is valuable and perhaps where it's less so.
You're really making us think today and decide, do we want to look at the news? What should we get out of it? And then kind of almost I'm thinking of a ping pong game going back and forth. Am I in favor of it because I have a bias? Am I in favor or against it because the news station is presenting it that way? And then in a sense, at least personally, I think I'm almost more confused. Am I the only one on that path, or is that all of us?
I think there's definitely a bit of searching to be done in terms of an understanding to be done to answer all of those questions, to understand what the purpose of the news is, full stop, but then also to be able to define our relationship with it and see how it's useful to us on a personal level, but also as a society. And that's hopefully what my book addresses. I had 1,000,001 questions about the news because I was a news junkie. I used to watch it regularly, and I got to the point where I couldn't bear to hear another news story. And it was a gradual progression that moved me from someone who watched it almost obsessively to someone who could no longer stand it. And all of these questions that I had along the way of that journey, but also looking at ways that could re-engage me in a way that made me informed and empowered, every single question along that journey I wanted to investigate, and not just from my own personal experience, but from others as well. So I went back to university. I did a master's in positive psychology. I did my thesis on, the negativity bias. And then I created my own research to investigate what happens when people include solutions-focused news into their media diet. I've worked with press in the US and helped research the impact of their work on news consumers. And all of that is documented in this book. So hopefully, all of these questions that you have, it's a very shared experience. And hopefully, if other things are coming up for anyone listening to this show as well, hopefully a lot of this will be addressed in the book and you might find the answers there.
Jodie, we want to find out more about what you're saying and what we should and should not listen to on the news. But at this point in the show, it's time to take a break and let our audience know that I'm Bill Horan. Our guest today is Jodie Jackson, speaking about You Are What You Read. You're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. We'll be back after the break.
As a veteran, I know that for many former servicemen and women, the battle doesn't always end when they come home. Every day, 184 veterans are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and sadly, 20 take their own lives. When nothing else helps, professionally trained service dogs can. American Humane, serving the U.S. military for over 100 years, rescues animals in need of forever homes and trains them to become free, life-saving service dogs for our nation's veterans. If you're a veteran or know a veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury, please go to AmericanHumane.org to learn about their Pups for Patriots program. Let's give our veterans a fighting chance.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Bill Horan, and today our guest is Jodie Jackson, author of You Are What You Read. Jodie, one of the things I found very cute in your book, you talk about some false headlines that you've come across, and one of them is cuddling your kitten could kill you. And I think that's a good way to kind of explain what you're getting at in that topic. Could you tell us about that and how that headline worked out?
Well, that was created quite a lot of media hype, and lots of different news organizations actually published similar articles with equally fear-filled headlines. But the problem is, the headline offers a misleading summary of the article, and the article offers a misleading summary of the research. And so the whole thing kind of becomes fairly sensationalized and fabricated, because with this particular article, it showed that there are only 500 people a year who are submitted to hospital as a result of, I think it's a certain bacteria that's underneath the cat claws. And it's only those with an immunodeficiency disorder like HIV that are actually at any substantial risk. So when you have a headline saying cuddling your cats could kill you, and they put kill in capital letters, I think how many cat owners there are, you think that's something that's affecting all of us, and how has this been under our nose all this time? But when you dig deeper into it, you realize actually that's it's actually pretty false and not something that we should all be concerned about. There is something to be concerned about, but we should make sure that we have the appropriate level of risk associated with that particular issue.
Jodie, I think there was a comment I got on one of the pages of your book. Academic research and news stories are like broccoli for the brain. What does that mean? It's something that's actually, it was said to me, and it's been said to me a few times by journalists, because they see it as their role. When they say broccoli for the brain, it's not necessarily that it tastes good or that it's appealing, but that it's very good for us. And there's an element of truth in that. It is good for us to know what's going on in the world and to be informed. But the trouble is, where the news was perhaps maybe broccoli, considered quite, perhaps a little bit dull and boring, but very valuable, nutritionally speaking, the environment's changed now.
the commercial environment that the news now exists in has jacked up all of their kind of sales techniques to get our attention. And so it's turned this analogy, rather than being broccoli for the brain, they've kind of deep fried the broccoli and it's now served with sweet and sour sauce. So it may be palatable, easy to consume and exciting, but it's no longer of much value. And in fact, it doesn't really even offer the benefits of broccoli anymore.
Now, we don't even get the benefits of the broccoli, huh? Now, news organizations, did I read that they actually have headline departments to kind of seduce us to read a particular story?
Yeah, they do. They've now got departments within news organizations that kind of do A/B testing. So they'll create the headline, which is generated for the purpose of grabbing our attention, more so than it is to summarize the article. Because sometimes you might get hooked in on a headline and you start reading and you actually realize that they're not that compatible. And what they do is they pick a headline and then they'll do A/B testing. So they might pick two headlines. They'll run them both for 5 minutes. They'll see which one gets the most attention, because they have such real-time feedback nowadays. And then that will be the headline that they then run with across all platforms.
Now, Jodie, we'd like to let our audience know that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Today, our very smart guest is Jodie Jackson, and she is the author of a book, You Are What You Read. Jodie, could you tell us where the book is available and if there's a website that you want to key us into where we can learn more about this subject?
Yeah, the book's available. In the US, it's available on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and IndieBound, which I think it lists all of the independent book stockists in the US who have a copy of the book. And the website is youarewhatyouread.com. So it has lots of information there about the movement of solutions journalism, gives you practical tools for how to take greater control of your media diet, and has a starter kit on there if you want to learn more about solutions journalism.
Now, it seems that more news that we see or read concerns the extraordinary rather than the ordinary. Something either unusual or way out there that, man from space pops up at some local store or something like that. Is that just to get attention, kind of curving the headlines? Or is there a reason for that? Do we get attracted more to the oddball story?
I think that there's kind of two strands to it. I think that some of the most devastating things that happen are extreme and they are extraordinary. And so, there is an element of value that we need from those stories, and they will always be fairly extreme. But the trouble is, because every story is extreme and every story is extraordinary, or at least if it's not, the way in which it's spoken about it is extreme. It actually normalizes it. So in psychology, again, you have, and I'm sure it's a term that everybody's heard, adaptation. And we have adaptation to make sure that we don't get completely overwhelmed by our stimulus. So when you're a child, you grow up and you learn life bit by bit. And that way it's all digestible and it's all manageable. So something that you perhaps found incredibly challenging at one point, like driving, when you're first learning to drive a manual car, it becomes second nature where you don't give it a thought. And the same thing happens with our information that we receive. We're dulled to it. The more we experience it, the more we're exposed to it, the more we're dulled to it, the less sensitive we become to it, and the more normal it becomes to us. So by having this very unvaried strategy of just reporting on the extreme and the extraordinary, it desensitizes us to it. We come to expect it. We're no longer shocked by it, and we become apathetic. So we're not necessarily taking action where we probably should. So one of the ways that you can combat this is it's called the duration effect. So when you introduce time periods in between these periods of stimulation, it can resensitize you to them. So another suggestion that I make in my book as to how we can improve our media diet is to read slow journalism. So rather than checking into the news every day or even every hour of every day, opt for a weekly news magazine and although there's an element of knowing what's going on because, everyone's tuned into social media and the news runs through it so frequently now, if we can introduce more deliberately a duration effect between when we're consuming our news, we will resensitize ourselves to it, and it will have a bigger impact. And hopefully, the reason these stories are being shared is to have something done about them, and it can help encourage action like that.
Why always the bad news? We seem to see that instead of saying something good, 300 people saved, 10 dead in boat accident or bus accident or something.
I think the main reason for the imbalance is because of the huge resistance from people both inside and outside of the news to acknowledge success and progress in society. And the reason people find it difficult is because it can be seen to undermine the ongoing suffering that still exists. And also people worry that it will give us a false sense of security. And there's two things I'd say back to that, because recognizing progress doesn't mean that we ignore problems, and nor does it mean that these problems are solved. Far from it. We can recognize how a situation's improved, but that a problem still exists and that there's still a long way to go. And the second thing I'd say is, without reporting on progress, we're left with a false sense of insecurity. And this is what makes us believe that the world is worse than it actually is. So I think that it's, there's this kind of competitiveness between them of what's the most important. How can we talk about this when there's this going on? How can we talk about what's working when there's so much terrible disaster? How can we talk about these people being saved when these 10 people are dead? It puts it in a very competitive framing rather than recognizing there's value in both. How did we save those people? Can it be replicated? Can we prevent those 10 people dying? Not necessarily saying that every issue is linked to another, but there's a lot you can learn from solutions. There's a lot of value in that information to see how things are working rather than just see how they're failing.
Jodie, once again, we want our audience to know that our guest has been Jodie Jackson. Her book is You Are What You Read. And Jodie, could you tell us about the website real quick again?
Yeah, the website's youarewhatyouread.com.
And if you're getting tired of all that news out there, maybe you want to read what Jodie has to say about it. It'll alert you what to look for and how you can find the stories that will make your life better rather than keep you on edge and anxious and a bit nervous, as much of this news is doing to all of us today. Jodie, thanks so much for being with us today. We'd like to remind our audience that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.